The American Yawp, Chapter 11, Growth and Conflict, Section 8, Westward Expansion and the Politics of Slavery, questions over slavery's fate in the West endured in the United States. In late 1839, following the collective defeat of its four scattered candidates in the presidential election of 1836, the Whig Party held their first national convention in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Emboldened by President Martin Van Buren's failure to control the panic of 1837 and seeking to take advantage of the growing call for reform, to party founder Henry Clay's disappointment, the convention voted to nominate not him, but General William Henry Harrison of Ohio as the Whig candidate for president in 1840. Harrison was known primarily for defeating Shawnee warriors led by Tecumseh before and during the War of 1812, most famously at the Battle of Tippecanoe in present-day Indiana. Whig leaders viewed him as a candidate with broad patriotic appeal. They portrayed him as the log cabin and hard cider candidate, a plain man of the country, unlike the Easterner Martin Van Buren. To balance the ticket with a Southerner, the Whigs nominated a slave-owning Virginia Senator, John Tyler, for vice president. A compromise candidate, Tyler was originally a Democrat and a Jackson supporter in the 1820s and 1830s. Although he had broken with Jackson over his stance on states' rights during the nullification crisis in 1832, Tyler never fully identified with the Whigs' platform of government-led reform so popular among moralists and middle-class reformers across the expanding and changing country. Although Tippecanoe, and Tyler too, easily won the presidential election of 1840, this choice of ticket turned out to be disastrous for the Whigs. Harrison became ill and died after just 31 days in office. Harrison thus holds the ironic honor of having the longest inaugural address and the shortest term in office of any American president, 31. Vice President Tyler became president and soon adopted policies that looked far more like Andrew Jackson's than like a Whig's. After Tyler twice vetoed charters for another bank of the United States, nearly his entire cabinet resigned, and the Whigs in Congress expelled his accidency from the party. The crisis of Tyler's administration was just one sign of the Whig Party's difficulty uniting around issues besides opposition to Democrats. The Whig Party succeeded in electing one more president, but remained deeply divided. Its problems grew as the issue of slavery strained the Union in the 1850s. Likewise, the push west only exacerbated the moral concerns of anti-slavery advocates in the North and Midwest and underlined the politically fraught prospects of slave state representation in Congress and the national government more generally. Westward expansion seemed to also imply an expansion of the slave interest, as Southern filibusters contemplated ways to graft new slaveholding territories onto the expanding nation. The 1840s opened with a number of disturbing developments for anti-slavery leaders. The 1842 Supreme Court case, Prigg v. Pennsylvania, ruled that the federal government's Fugitive Slave Act trumped Pennsylvania's personal liberty law. Anti-slavery activists believed that the federal government only served Southern enslavers, who were trouncing the states' rights of the North. A number of northern states reacted by passing new personal liberty laws in protest in 1843. The rising controversy over the status of freedom-seeking people swelled partly through the influence of escaped formerly enslaved people, including Frederick Douglass. Other formerly enslaved people, including Sojourner Truth, joined Douglass in rousing support for anti-slavery, as did free black Americans like Maria Stewart, James McCune Smith, Martin Delany, and numerous others. Points 33. But black activists did more than deliver speeches. They also attacked the fugitive slave laws by helping thousands to escape. The incredible career of Harriet Tubman is one of the more dramatic examples. But the forces of slavery had powerful allies at every level of government, and as the 1840s progressed, those committed to the cause of abolition and anti-slavery would look for new political options as they continued to challenge the institutions of slavery. The Whig Party had initially formed in opposition to Andrew Jackson's presidency, and out of this opposition, it blamed Democrats for defending slavery at the expense of the American people. Yet anti-slavery was never a core component of the Whig platform. Several abolitionists grew so disgusted with the Whigs that they formed their own party, a true anti-slavery party. Activists in Warsaw, New York, organized the Anti-Slavery Liberty Party in 1839. Liberty leaders demanded the end of slavery in the District of Columbia, the end of the interstate slave trade, and the prohibition of slavery's expansion into the West. But the Liberty Party also shunned women's participation in the movement and distanced itself from visions of true racial egalitarianism. Few Americans voted for the party. The Democrats and Whigs continued to dominate American politics. With this political status quo, Democrats and Whigs fostered a moment of relative calm on the slavery debate, partially aided by gag rules prohibiting discussion of anti-slavery petitions. Arkansas and Michigan became the newest states admitted to the Union, with Arkansas coming in as a slave state and Michigan coming in as a free state. Michigan gained admission through provisions established in the Northwest Ordinance, while Arkansas came in under the Missouri Compromise. Since its lands were below the line at 36 degrees 30, the admission of Arkansas did not threaten the Missouri Consensus. The balancing act between slavery and freedom continued. Events in Texas would shatter the balance. In 1836, Anglo-Texans in the northern Mexican province of Tejas had successfully forced General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, then president of Mexico, to sign a treaty acknowledging Texas's independence as a separate republic. Independent Texas soon gained recognition from a supportive Andrew Jackson administration in 1837, but Jackson's successor, President Martin Van Buren, also a Democrat, had reasons to worry about the Republic of Texas. Texas struggled with ongoing conflicts with Mexico and raids from the powerful Comanche. The 1844 Democratic presidential candidate, James K. Polk, sought to bridge the sectional divide by promising new lands to whites in the North and South. Polk cited the annexation of Texas and the Oregon Territory as campaign cornerstones. Yet, as Polk championed the acquisition of these vast new lands, Northern Democrats grew annoyed by their Southern colleagues, especially when it came to Texas. Texas annexation had remained a political landmine since the Republic declared independence from Mexico in 1836. American politicians feared that adding Texas to the Union would provoke a war with Mexico and reignite sectional tensions by throwing off the balance between free and slave states. However, after his expulsion from the Whig Party, President John Tyler saw Texas statehood as the key to saving his political career. In 1842, he began work on opening annexation to national debate. Harnessing public outcry over the issue, Democrat James K. Polk rose from virtual obscurity to win the presidential election of 1844. Polk and his party campaigned on promises of westward expansion, with eyes towards Texas, Oregon, and California. In the final days of his presidency, Tyler at last extended an official offer to Texas on March 3, 1845. The Republic accepted on July 4, becoming the 28th state. Mexico denounced annexation as an act of aggression, the most unjust which can be found recorded in the annals of modern history. 35 beyond the anger produced by annexation, the two nations both laid claim over a narrow strip of land between two rivers. Mexico drew the southwestern border of Texas at the Nueces River, but Texans claimed that the border lay roughly 150 miles farther west at the Rio Grande. Neither claim was realistic, since the sparsely populated area, known as the Nueces Strip, was in fact controlled by Native Americans. For many observers, the debates over Texas statehood illustrated that the federal government had fallen into the hands of pro-slavery radicals. Texas President Sam Houston managed to secure a deal with Polk and gained admission to the Union for Texas in 1845. Anti-slavery Northerners also worried about the admission of Florida, which entered the Union as a slave state in 1845. The year 1845 became a pivotal year in the memory of anti-slavery leaders. As Americans embraced calls to pursue their manifest destiny, anti-slavery voices looked at developments in Florida and Texas as signs that the sectional crisis had taken an ominous and perhaps irredeemable turn. Section 9, the U.S.-Mexican War, the Polk presidency signaled new reversals to the anti-slavery cause and the beginnings of a dark new era in American politics. President Polk and his Democratic allies were eager to see Western lands brought into the Union and were especially anxious to see the borders of the nation extended to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. Critics of the administration blasted these efforts as little more than land grabs on behalf of enslavers. In November 1845, President Polk secretly dispatched John Slidell to Mexico City to purchase the Nueces Strip, along with large sections of New Mexico and California. The mission was an empty gesture, designed largely to pacify those in Washington who insisted on diplomacy before war. Predictably, officials in Mexico City refused to receive Slidell. In preparation for the assumed failure of the negotiations, Polk preemptively sent a 4,000-man army under General Zachary Taylor to Corpus Christi, Texas, just northeast of the Nueces River. Upon word of Slidell's rebuff in January 1846, Polk ordered Taylor to cross into the disputed territory. The president hoped that this show of force would push the lands of California onto the bargaining table as well. Unfortunately, he badly misread the situation. After losing Texas, the Mexican public strongly opposed surrendering any more ground to the United States. Popular opinion left the shaky government in Mexico City without room to negotiate. On April 24, Mexican cavalrymen attacked a detachment of Taylor's troops in the disputed territory just north of the Rio Grande, killing 11 U.S. soldiers. The KG Polk knew that since hostilities already existed, political dissent would be dangerous. A vote against war became a vote against supporting American soldiers under fire. Congress passed a declaration of war on May 13. Only a few members of both parties, notably John Quincy Adams and John C. Calhoun, opposed the measure. Upon declaring war in 1846, Congress issued a call for 50,000 volunteer soldiers. Spurred by promises of adventure and conquest abroad, thousands of eager men flocked to assembly points across the country. However, opposition to Mr. Polk's war soon grew. Polk's shady actions in leading Congress to war in early 1846 seemed to justify anti-slavery complaints. Whigs, like Abraham Lincoln, found their initial protests to the war effort sidelined, but anti-slavery voices would become more vocal and more powerful as the Mexican War played out, and new territories became annexed to the victorious United States. In the early fall of 1846, the U.S. Army invaded Mexico on multiple fronts, and within a year's time, General Winfield Scott's men took control of Mexico City. However, the city's fall did not bring an end to the war. Scott's men occupied Mexico's capital for over 4 months while the two countries negotiated. In the United States, the war had been controversial from the beginning. Embedded journalists sent back detailed reports from the front lines, and a divided press viciously debated the news. Volunteers found that war was not as they expected. Disease killed 7 times as many American soldiers as combat. Harsh discipline, conflict within the ranks, and violent clashes with civilians led soldiers to desert in huge numbers. Peace finally came on February 2, 1848, with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Through the treaty, the United States gained lands that would become the future states of California, Utah, and Nevada, most of Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. Mexican officials also had to surrender their claims to Texas and recognize the Rio Grande as its southern boundary. The United States offered $15 million for all of it. With American soldiers occupying their capital, Mexican leaders had no choice but to sign. With the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and a newly forged peace, Polk opened up American expansion to the Pacific. New outlets for American expansion going forward, not just in Oregon, but also in the Great Basin, Southern Plains, and far southwest, became viable. The newly won American West attracted a diverse group of entrepreneurs and settlers to the commercial towns of New Mexico, the fertile lands of eastern Texas, the famed gold deposits of California, and the Rocky Mountains. This post-war migration built on earlier paths of travel dating back to the 1820s, when the lucrative Santa Fe trade enticed merchants to New Mexico and generous land grants brought numerous settlers to Texas. The Gadsden Purchase of 1854 further added to American gains north of Mexico and solidified the southern border from the Rio Grande across to the Pacific Ocean, while the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo secured vast tracts of land for American settlement, development, and overall expansion. The treaty infuriated anti-slavery leaders in the United States. The spoils of war were impressive, but it was clear they would help expand slavery. Anti-slavery activists, who already judged the Mexican War and enslavers' plot, vowed that none of the newly won territories should be open to slavery. But, knowing that the Liberty Party was also not likely to provide a home to many moderate voters, leaders fostered a new and more competitive party, which they called the Free Soil Party. Anti-slavery leaders had thought that their vision of a federal government divorced from slavery might be represented by the major parties in the presidential election of 1848, but both the Whigs and the Democrats nominated candidates hostile to the anti-slavery cause. Left unrepresented, anti-slavery Free Soil leaders swung into action, demanding an alternative to the pro-slavery status quo. Free Soil leaders assembled so-called conscience Whigs, the remnants of the Liberty Party, and anti-slavery Democrats under a new political umbrella. The Free Soil Coalition called for a national convention in August 1848 at Buffalo, New York. A number of ex-Democrats committed to the party right away, including an important group of New Yorkers loyal to Martin Van Buren. The Free Soil Party's platform bridged the Eastern and Western leadership together and called for an end to slavery in Washington, D.C., and a halt on slavery's expansion into the Western Territories, Point 38. The admission of Wisconsin as a free state in May 1848 helped cool tensions after the Texas and Florida admissions. Meanwhile, news from a number of failed European revolutions alarmed American reformers, but as exiled radicals filtered into the United States, a strengthening women's rights movement also flexed its muscle at Seneca Falls, New York. Frederick Douglass also appeared at the convention and took part in the proceedings, where participants debated the declaration of sentiments, grievances, and resolutions. By August 1848, it seemed plausible that the Free Soil movement might tap into these reforms and build a broader coalition. In some ways, that is precisely what it did. But come November, the spirit of reform failed to yield much at the polls. Whig candidate Zachary Taylor bested Democrat Lewis Cass of Michigan. The Free Soil movement hardly made a dent in the 1848 presidential election, but it drew more than 4 times the popular vote won by the Liberty Party in earlier elections. It was a promising start. In 1848, Free Soil leaders claimed just 10% of the popular vote, but won over a dozen House seats and even managed to win one Senate seat in Ohio, which went to Salmon P. Chase. In Congress, Free Soil members had enough votes to swing power to either the Whigs or the Democrats, making them a sizable minority party that could no longer be ignored. In the years ahead, concerns about slavery's expansion west and the pro-slavery leanings of the national government would continue to fuel the Free Soil opposition movement. Section 10 conclusion, expansion, in both the reform efforts of society's morals and politics, and in the territorial sense as Americans pushed westward, shaped the era. In the aftermath of Jacksonian democracy's advent on the national stage, Americans wrestled with how to shape the continent and its people in its own image. Various interest groups also increasingly debated how that American future for the continent would take shape, what role religion would play, what voice women might have in it, and crucially, whether the institution of slavery would be permitted to spill westward. Despite the prior controversies and compromises of Missouri, the U.S.-Mexican War had an enormous impact on these questions and shaped the future of both countries. The American victory helped set the United States on the path to becoming a world power. It elevated Zachary Taylor to the presidency and served as a training ground for many of the Civil War's future commanders. Most significantly, Mexico lost roughly half of its territory. Yet the U.S. victory was not without danger. Ralph Waldo Emerson, an outspoken critic of the conflict, had predicted ominously at the beginning of the war, "We will conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man who swallows the arsenic which will bring him down in turn. Mexico will poison us." Indeed, the conflict over whether to extend slavery into the newly won territory pushed the nation ever closer to disunion and civil war. The chauvinism of policies like Native American removal, the Mexican War, and filibustering existed alongside growing anxiety over the morality of the nation's actions in the West and its continued reliance on slave labor in the South. Debates over reform, economics, diplomacy, and manifest destiny exposed some of the key weaknesses of the American system, begging the question of whether the nation could survive the growing pains of expansion in all of its capacities.